It's the year ending Thursday the 31st of December 2020, and this is the year Unwrapped. In the past 12 months, we've seen Joe Biden beating Donald Trump in the US presidential election, the UK finally leaving the EU, and a global pandemic causing over 1 million deaths. But we're here to consider some of the trends that passed under the radar this year, big changes that haven't made headlines but are slowly affecting the way we live our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the year. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are Joe Evans from the Week Junior, Felicity Capon, and freelance journalist Kieran Yates is back on the show. And Kieran, you're starting this week. What do you think this year should be remembered for?
Is this the year that capitalist chickens are coming home to roost?
Now, this is a very interesting scene here. This is a bit of labour discipline for the chickens going on, so they all have to line up, and they're judged on their productivity. So much like you've got your targets and things at work, these chickens have a target of how many eggs can they get. So they're only valued, they're not valued for being lovely big chickens, not valued for being a chicken. Look, that chicken's got a hat on, like, incredible, having little pearls and all of that. Oh, they're very individual chickens, these chickens.
A commentary on the wider themes of the Aardman movie Chicken Run in a series called Marxism Made Easy by YouTuber Grimbags. Kieran, in this year of a global pandemic, what is your most overlooked story of the year?
Well, I think if we're talking about trends, that Marxist reading of Chicken Run sums it up pretty nicely. You know, the chickens coming together and seizing the means of egg production. I think this is something that lots of people have probably recognised if they've been, online on social media, especially on TikTok, Snapchat and Instagram, which is these...
Always with the TikToks.
Yes, I know. But it's kind of the abundance of very specific kind of socialist or left-leaning content, which comes in the form often of big meme accounts. One of the biggest called Marxist Lenin Meme Party that has over 30,000 followers. But it's also hooked to a conversation I was having with Penguin Press this year, who said that they had seen a 30% increase in the physical sales of the Communist Manifesto this year, and a 1,366% increase in audiobooks. I'm not quite sure what that statistic refers to, but the cleverer amongst our listeners will know.
So people listening to the Communist Manifesto whilst they go about working from home.
That's right.
Interesting. Why do you think that's happening? Why do you think people are turning to Marx?
Well, I think that there are some obvious reasons, hooked specifically to this year, which come in the form of thinking newly about the way that we spend when you're inside and, having to think more carefully about consumption, full stop. But I think also that the reason that this is most interesting for us or for the purpose of our discussion is because it really lends us to thinking about how we're thinking about work in the future. Now, this year, there have been some articles that have been saying that we've moved from the gig economy generation to the hustle economy, i.e. these models like Substack or Tiny Letter or Patreon and even OnlyFans, where people are providing content themselves through various digital means, and then people donate from your wider community.
But that's entrepreneurialism, isn't it? That's capitalism at work. That's not communism.
It is entrepreneurial, but it's more about how we're thinking about work, and we're thinking about ownership, and we're thinking about who does it and how we can use that as a springboard to talk about communities and speaking directly to your community and saying, okay, are there other solutions? Now, I'm not saying all the solutions are communist ones, but I am saying that this piggybacks us into thinking about how we're going to work in the future.
But hasn't there always been an interest in communism and Marxism, especially amongst young people, Joe? I mean, yes, okay, we might see statistics for physical sales and audiobook sales of the Communist Manifesto going up, but I'm prepared to bet that, there's been a slump in sales at Athena of the Che Guevara poster. So isn't it just people switching mediums and, just a new manifestation of the same interest amongst students, basically?
I think you're right to say that there has always been an interest in sort of left-wing politics, especially among young people. And I mean, an obvious retort to the sort of spike in interest in it this year is that this kind of comeback that people get more conservative as they get older. And I think if you look at previous generations, that probably is true. If you look at people like Christopher Hitchens that were sort of marching with the Marxist parties at university that became increasingly more conservative as they grew up. But I think this is probably a kind of logical extension of the sort of online radicalism that in the past we've been quite concerned about, because it's always been in reference to right-wing politics and the concern that people will be dragged to the right. But I think there's this idea of the kind of the funnel that people experience online or when they're using social media, and this slight paradox that actually what social media was meant to do was open you up to the world, and what it's actually ended up doing is funneled people more and more into narrow spaces in which kind of singular ideas tend to dominate. And, when you look at kind of Reddit and look at communities there, that's kind of one example of this. And so I think it's probably just a case of the fact that kind of young viewers that are becoming interested in politics, as Kieran says, there's lots of reasons that they would be getting interested in left-wing politics, just because kind of the state of the country and the planet would maybe lend those ideas some credence in their eyes. And sort of starting with relatively tame content and then sort of slowly wading into more and more radical content as they travel down that funnel.
Yeah, we've talked before, haven't we, Felicity, about how algorithms on everything from kind of Facebook to Pornhub push you into more extreme material because that's going to give you a longer viewing time on their website. Do you think that's what this is? People just sort of being forwarded into polarised views?
I mean, I really can't work out this story at all. It's very hard to know that. I mean, I think, as you were saying, Ollie, I think there has always been an enduring interest in Karl Marx and Marxism. I'm not sure that 2020 is particularly different in that sense. And I do think it is fascinating, his enduring legacy, particularly in that the year Marx died in 1883 at the age of 64, only 11 people showed up to his funeral. And for most of his career, he was completely unknown outside his bubble of revolutionary exiles. And the books he's famous for were not bestsellers in his time at all. So on one aspect, that's absolutely fascinating. In terms of why people are drawn to it and downloading it, I mean, whether it's something they actually are fully understanding, I think there's so much sort of confusion between Marxism and communism and socialism, and whether it's something they are purely interested in from a history point of view, or whether it's something more to do with disillusionment with how the world is working today and a kind of desire to change it, I would find that more worrying. I just don't think we know where the interest is coming from. I think I can see why Marxism is ostensibly attractive. The idea that we can sort of rip up the status quo, the idea that the Communist Manifesto still sort of powerfully resonates today is of course all true. But I think we should also find it slightly worrying in that the reason why I imagine younger people find Marxism appealing is that for them it's untainted with association with Stalinist gulags and the inherent violence that you find within Marxism. I mean, revolution was implicit in Marx's writing. He said, "Let the ruling classes tremble." It is a violent and destructive ideology. And so I think if that's something that young people are reading today and kind of missing out the history, that I find incredibly worrying.
I suppose it is, though, just a demonstration that younger people are becoming increasingly involved in politics, isn't it, Kieran? And I suppose if you look at the issues that generally have got them out onto the streets over the last year, climate action, Black Lives Matter, there's a Venn diagram there with, I guess, people who are concerned about the problems that have been allowed to flourish under capitalism and people who might be interested in communism as a solution to that.
Yeah, but all of those conversations to me is really about the democratization of information, which social media has enabled for young people. So, it's true that Marx has always had an appetite with students, maybe in college or university, when they come to this reading, and they might come to it from various different places. But the reason that this is interesting is because there's a lot of peer-to-peer learnings. There's a lot of guidance that's happening in platforms like TikTok, where people are saying, okay, you might be reading about how during this pandemic, capitalism hasn't been working effectively. Let's talk about exactly what that means. You might be thinking about unionizing, like we talked earlier in this year about influencer unions. You might be talking about, wealth distribution, welfare. You might be tired about the rampant individualism of influencer culture. And if that's how you are feeling, which I would argue is increasingly how younger people are feeling, then one of the places that people are going to have these discussions are online, and they're not necessarily going to a library, which might be inaccessible for them for whatever reasons, or they might not be going into further or higher education. So I think I think it speaks to the fact that everybody's online at the moment, now more than ever because they're inside. But also, I like the sort of accessibility of this information. And I take the point that Felicity says about this idea that they're coming to this in a sort of purer way, untainted by the more radical ideologies that underpin this. But actually, I think they're coming to it from news stories. So they've heard these words in the news increasingly this year, and they're going to learn about what exactly that means from peers of their own age. And I think that's a good thing.
But should politicians be paying attention to this, Joe? Is it significant enough that they should? Because after all, Boris Johnson won the election, not Jeremy Corbyn. Bernie Sanders is not the next president of the United States. So, there may be increasing lefty voices, but it doesn't look like that's the way to win votes necessarily.
No, not necessarily. But I don't think that should be a reason to not take seriously the views of people that very seriously hold views, whether they're in a kind of large number or small number. And we've seen the impact that small pressure groups can have on British politics. As you mentioned in the intro, we're finally leaving Brexit, and it started out as a fringe thing and is now, well, we're all Brexiteers now because we're leaving on the 31st. And I think it's true to say that, young people are coming to this because they probably don't have, or they're not children of the Cold War. I'm not a child of the Cold War, it's not my lived experience either. And I would imagine not many of the young people that are kind of engaging with Marxist meme accounts spend the rest of their time, reading Solzhenitsyn and understanding the horrors of Soviet gulags, as Felicity says. The problem being that I don't think that's going to work. That isn't a way to that's not going to be a way to convince young people that this isn't a viable solution to their quite reasonable issues with economic liberalism. I think you're going to need a better answer than, but the Soviet Union was horrible, because what people have, young people have kind of grown up through the financial crisis, and they have reason to have very little faith in financial markets.
But they also have reason to look at current policies, Felicity, and find some things that are closer to the sort of things they'd like to see. I mean, whether they'd prefer to or not, governments across the world have been spending like they're socialists this year to keep the pandemic at bay. So I suppose perhaps a real-world implication of all of this might be more pressure on the Chancellor in this country to keep some of those policies going for longer than they might have done otherwise.
Possibly. I'm not sure we can make that link. I'm not sure we can say it's pressure from younger people that made Rishi Sunak keep that going longer than he'd want to. I think it remains to be seen what happens with government spending. I imagine we are all going to have to pick up the bill in the not too very soon future. I think
that's a safe prediction.
Exactly. It's not something that it's going to... I mean, yes, it has been a lifeline this year, but it's not exactly going to last, is it? I mean, ultimately, I think anything where people are getting more involved in politics, whatever end of the spectrum, I think anything where people are looking back at history and actually learning the lessons of it and not sort of whitewashing things, I support those entirely. I think I would just return to my point that actually look at Marxism, study communism, have a look at, the systems, how it's happened before and what's gone wrong with them. And then take that forward into your discussions about the kind of future that you want to have. Like, I don't want to be down on young people, but just think about it.
But my point was, Kieran, to what extent the pandemic might have impacted this. And I mean, if you think about America, for example, you clearly see the advantages of free healthcare now, don't you? If you're an American, in ways that perhaps you didn't before. You clearly see the disparity between those who can afford to work at home and those who have to risk their lives to work on the front line. So these are things that tally nicely into that philosophy.
Yeah, but even, this summer, well, certainly kind of May, June, July, at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, some of the widest circulating quotes were from Fred Hampton, the one about, we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. And what you saw from lots of members or the founding members of Black Lives Matter activists was they were talking about abolition, but they were making it clear that this was actually about wealth distribution. This was about creating welfare in communities and, distributing in a way that they could create their own sort of welfare states, that they could create their own free healthcare in their communities. How can we take these ideas and use them in lots of different communities, lots of different activist ways? And I think that that's quite a useful way of thinking about how we can update some of this thinking to work for us to solve the very contemporary challenges that we have. I mean, free healthcare for me has always been a no-brainer, but I do think that it's interesting seeing how this seemingly historical texts are really having an impact on the thinking from young unionists, young people advocating for workers' rights, young people thinking about how employment and work is going to look next year, off the back of some funny TikTok videos or someone doing a bit of chicken run narration.
Okay, Joe, you're up next after this. OK, Joe, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
An unexpected COVID success story.
Mathare is like the second largest slum in Kenya. This is a place where there is very poor sanitization. People in this community live from hand to mouth. The issue of social distancing is quite impossible to achieve because there are a lot of people living in such a squeezed area. So it's important to give like the correct information and the correct practical measures these people can use to protect themselves.
Nairobi street artist Masale speaking to The Guardian in May. Joe, tell us what he was up to there.
Yes, so that was a young street artist that was painting instructions for how to respond to the COVID pandemic. You know, same kind of instructions that the government have been giving us all year. The hands, face, space. Hands, face, space. See, it's gone in so well that we both said it at the same time. The reason I bring this is because at the beginning of the pandemic, as I'm sure you'll remember, the media was just chock full of public health experts and speculative features suggesting that Africa was going to be absolutely battered by the pandemic. And then it just didn't really happen. Specifically, I wanted to talk about Kenya, which I think could be kind of considered a COVID success story. At the time of recording, it's reported just 1,500 deaths and around 89,000 confirmed cases, meaning that around 2% of the patients that have caught COVID in Kenya have died so far. To give that some sort of sense of scale, the population of Kenya is around 51 million people compared with 66 million here. And the UK, as we all know at the time of recording, again, has recorded around 62,000 deaths and 1.7 million cases.
But Kenya has a very different demographic, doesn't it, to the UK?
Yes, so this seems to be one of the reasons that has been sort of hypothesised for what is happening. Kenyans...
They're younger, basically.
Yes. Kenyans' youthfulness is likely a big factor in this. Half the population is under 20, and only 4% of the population are older than 60. Just again, for scale, by comparison, the ONS gives the average age in the UK is around 40, and 18% of the population here is over 65, which obviously would put them in a higher risk group. But what it's meant is that Kenya has been able to report these incredible statistics on its response to the coronavirus and the death rate related to the coronavirus, which has massively kind of subverted expectations when at the beginning of the year there was this suggestion that poorer third world countries, the developing world, was going to be absolutely battered by this pandemic. And it's actually been the sort of richer developed countries that were making these predictions that have ended up bearing the brunt in terms of deaths.
I mean, do you agree, Felicity, that that's a tipping point, that so-called developing countries are now stealing a march on the old order?
I'm not sure it is such a success story, I'm afraid. I'm not sure I agree with this. Kenya imposed a dusk to dawn curfew, and at one point more people had been shot for defying it than had died of COVID-19. So I think some of the measures that were implemented in Kenya to restrict the spread of the virus were pretty horrendous, actually. And I was reading something in the Financial Times which kind of looked at the global response to COVID, and they spoke to someone who was going around distributing soap to slum dwellers in Nairobi who said, they're telling me they'd rather die from coronavirus than die from hunger. So I'm just not sure it's such a success story. I think there will be other factors as well as to why the death rate has been so low. For example, it's a country that has lots of sunshine. I think the humidity, I think being closer to the equator, I think we don't think we know for certain quite how those factor in, but I think they would probably come into it. There's also been the fact that the not only shooting people who don't observe quarantine, but the quarantine measures themselves has been pretty draconian with people sort of locked away. So I think there has been all sorts of problems. I think the one thing I would say, talking about Africa as a continent as a whole, I do think they have a very interesting advantage compared to richer countries and that's that they know an awful lot already about infectious diseases. And as a result, they have experts scattered across the continent who know all sorts of things about endemic diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis and cholera. And I was very impressed to read that, and I think that's why Africa as a continent was much more on the ball early on before the West, who I think was sort of very, very complacent and never thought this would impact their nations in the way it has done. Not long after the first COVID cases hit the continent, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, he began organising weekly video conferences to coordinate the whole of Africa's response. And I think that's very impressive. But I think in each individual African countries, I'm not sure the picture would be quite so rosy.
I wonder as well, Kieran, whether it's just, frankly, a bit too early to declare who's been the victor at coronavirus. You know, we've seen kind of Sweden dip in and out of fashion as a reference point for how they've dealt with the pandemic, sort of depending on what the statistics look like at the time that someone mentions them. I mean, as we've discovered, second waves come, third waves will come before people in Africa are immunised. So can we say at this point, you know, Kenya has dealt with this particularly well?
Well, I'm not sure because, of course, it's too early. But one of the things that I found most interesting as a journalist is the geographical mapping of COVID has lent us to look at the cultural differences between each nation state's approach and the way that they've been dealing with this. And I think that looking at some of the ways in which developing countries has done this has actually been quite useful for us, because it did seem, I agree with Felicity, it did seem very early on that the British resolve had this idea that, you know, that COVID wouldn't have the audacity to come and flatten our nation. Whereas I think for a lot of developing countries, there was this idea that, okay, this is a real threat. It potentially could cripple our nation. What are the things that we're going to put in to make sure that we're dealing with all of the details that other developing countries might not be dealing with? I did a story in Jamaica earlier on in the year, and one of the things that I thought was quite interesting, and this seems to be echoed across lots of West and East African countries, was the idea of the kind of community heads speaking to the community, and it not coming across as, you know, busybody snitching as it has in Britain a little bit. And this idea that because there is a culture of, you know, peer teaching, or, you know, elders of a community kind of getting involved and saying, actually, you should be doing this. Are you taking the supplement? Are you washing your hands? Maybe you should go inside. It seemed that it was received better on the ground. Whereas I think culturally, we haven't really taken to this idea of being told what to do by our politicians, neighbours, teachers, or even parents.
And that's a hard lesson to learn, isn't it? You're not going to change the national fabric of character overnight. But Joe, what could we learn from Kenya? I mean, if it isn't just about demographics, if it isn't about the way they're counting deaths as well, I noticed they only count hospital deaths, so who knows how many people are dying at home. But if it's not that, if you disregard all that and you say, yes, Kenya's a success story, what should we be doing that you know, we could pick up from them?
I think what Kieran just said is really interesting about the sort of tradition of community learning and community exchange of information is quite interesting, actually, because one of the things that has been posited as a possible reason that Africa's experienced lower coronavirus deaths is that there's a suggestion that HIV medication seems to lower the severity of COVID infection. Now, the science on that is a bit sketchy, but the way that the HIV drugs are rolled out in Africa was exactly through that kind of community learning. That it was quite quickly realised that if you were going to roll out anti-HIV medication, you were going to have to get community leaders on side, because it was going to be community leaders that were going to be able to convince the rest of their particular community to go along with accepting these kinds of drugs. And so I think that is very interesting, what Kieran has just said, that, you know, we could probably learn from having a slightly less centralised approach and a slightly more federal approach in which we accept the fact that local community leaders, whether they're in the UK or in Kenya, probably do recognise how to convey information to people that live nearby them, and also probably understand the situation on the ground better than centralised leaders. It should also be noted that Kenya also moved to enact measures to protect people economically against this quite quickly. For example, they implemented a Tax Law Amendment Act which reduced the tax burden on people. They expanded civil servant health insurance to country level health workers, and you know, those kinds of economic measures were rolled out, you know, surprisingly quickly in a country that or in a region that we traditionally think of as being sort of economically unstable and unable to do those kinds of things.
I just think on the community point, though, that could be, it does sound great. And I think I was reading about it, Kenya's Harambee spirit. I think this culture of people uniting in times of need, that has a really long history. But I do worry that could be just be used as a way for governments to pass the buck. I don't see that it's necessarily a good thing if community initiatives have to be in place to replace formal social welfare systems. And I mean, you know, things like significant gaps in the capacity of hospitals to handle surges in the early stages of the pandemic, and the fact that I think only 22% of Kenya's population lived within 2 hours of a facility which had intensive care units. I don't think that's enough to say, well, if the community comes together, we can, you know, there's has to be something more substantial from the government than just a sort of good community feel.
Yeah, I think sorry, Kieran. I'm wary of criticising the Kenyan government for not having the necessary infrastructure to deal with a pandemic, because I think there's kind of, historical contingencies for why those countries are less developed than Western ones. But I think, I guess what I was referring to is that as Kieran says, what we've been very bad at here really is messaging. We've been, that was one of the massive errors in our immediate response to the pandemic. Highlight of 2020 must be Boris Johnson walking around a hospital shaking hands with COVID patients and then declaring proudly to everybody that he'd done so. And I think that is one thing that we could learn a lesson from, that kind of community messaging is very effective, and even has been quite effective in European countries with a more federalised, localised approach to the way that they dealt with the pandemic. For example, Germany has been celebrated.
Kieran, do you think that Western countries are open to learning lessons from Kenya?
Well, I think one of the things that you've certainly seen over the last few months after the racial disparity report earlier this year really mapped out the disproportionately high number of deaths from BAME communities in the UK. And one of the reactions to this was that people within communities was like, okay, we need to do better at messaging within our own communities. These are some of the things these are the ways we're going to do this. We're going to do this via mutual aid groups. We're going to do this via the internet. We're also going to do this by, commissioning shows and commissioning content and doing like neighbourhood online Zooms. And I think that for me, that has been a lot more effective when you feel like you're being failed by the government or by central government. Then, of course, you're looking to these solutions. So I'm not necessarily saying that we've inherited this from Kenyan politics, but I am saying that this is something that we could certainly be thinking more about, and in which I mean speaking directly to certain communities about the very specific things that they need to be taking in mind that central government isn't making clear to them, one of which talking about, vitamin D deficiencies or something like that.
So, Joe, can Kenya have a larger place on the world stage?
I mean, it actually already does have a very large place on the continental stage. It's the third biggest economy in Africa. It is, however, set to recover fairly quickly as well, which is perhaps surprising and subverts, again, expectations. The World Bank has predicted that it'll lift real GDP by nearly 7% next year. The economy is expected to contract, but by a fairly small 1% to 1.5% this year. Kenya signed a free trade agreement with Britain in early December, post-Brexit trade negotiations going well, and though how much that contributed to their economic recovery in 2021, I'll reserve judgment on. There is a kind of positive outlook for Kenya. It should be said that there's a slight fear that this will spread into more rural areas where the population is slightly older than the sort of the cities in Kenya, which have got, again, a younger population, which is possibly what has contributed to the sort of impressively low death rate so far.
Yeah. But, and as Felicity said, the beds are in Nairobi and Mombasa hospitals.
Yeah, absolutely. There is absolutely a fear that this will spread into, as I say, more rural areas where older people tend to go to retire. But there is there's a positive outlook economically, especially for the country, and if that kind of lifting real GDP can translate into lifting of living standard, then it would be a surprisingly quick spring back from a pandemic that has kind of derailed everybody's economies and everybody's way of life this year.
Okay, Felicity's going to be giving us her story of the year after this. Finally this year, it's Felicity. What do you think the last 12 months should really be remembered for?
Why 2020 was cancelled in more ways than just one.
What does it mean, this whole unsafe thing? Because she wouldn't have been the first person to use that line.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I think you do actually have to listen to people when they say they feel unsafe. I would say when women say, the whole Me Too movement has been often women say, I never really felt safe around that guy. So I would say we must listen to it. I don't dismiss it, but I think I'm talking more about behaviour.
Columnist Suzanne Moore, formerly of The Guardian, talking in December to Unheard. So, Felicity, you want to talk about safety. Give us your thesis.
Yeah, bear with me. I think my theory from this year is that we have sort of become obsessed with escaping from risk. And I feel that you can see that both in the response, and I'm talking about in the West and in the UK, we have become all too happy to adopt the slogan and sort of life mantra that extraordinary times calls for extraordinary measures. And we've given up a lot of our freedoms without so much as a backward glance, without parliamentary scrutiny, and not only in the response to the virus, but as Suzanne Moore was talking about there, the idea that almost even thought and ideas and on issues such as trans rights, for example, and the idea of how we define women, that we have become very, very obsessed with safety at the expense of our liberties and our freedoms.
Okay, I mean, I'm enjoying the thesis, but you're making a connection there between safety from a killer virus and safety when people talk about the word safety to really mean, as Suzanne Moore was saying there, kind of discomfort when they're reading something they don't agree with. Those are two different things, aren't they? They
are different, but I don't see that they're not interconnected. I think Suzanne Moore talks about a return to a sanitized culture, and the idea that ideas and opinions can make you feel unsafe, and how this is how book burning starts. And I think that the two link, because the freedoms that we have given up without parliamentary scrutiny, they encompass the right to assembly, the right to protest, the right to religion, the right to freedom of movement, the right to a free press. Ofcom has discouraged harmful reporting that might be seen counter to public health policy. So you can see why that, one promotes the other. I think I do see that from people these days, that, there's just too much out there that is controversial or scary or whatever, and let's just kind of ignore it, basically.
But Jo, people have been protesting, quite notably this year. People have been practicing their religion, just under different circumstances to perhaps how they'd usually congregate. And even if we're sort of combining this with cancel culture, people like Suzanne Moore, okay, she's not employed by The Guardian anymore, but 100,000 people at the time of recording have seen that video we just heard her do. So it's not like she's been silenced. There's still an audience to see her, and she's not been arrested for giving that interview. So you can think of counter-arguments, can't you?
Yeah, if I may, I'm going to take those as two separate points. I think the first one is on the COVID front. I'm not sure I do see the link between the sort of erosion of freedoms for the purpose of containing kind of an airborne disease and...
It's better not just be tit for tat because Felicity didn't agree about Kenya.
No, it's not at all. I think... You're right to say that there has been sort of large assemblies this year, and there's been incredibly moving and necessary large assembly this year, and it is notable that if you look at countries where support for stopping that kind of thing has remained higher, it is in countries that have got sort of less of a democratic tradition or a kind of flawed democratic model. So if you look at the YouGov public opinion polling, for example, on right to assembly, it's places like Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines that have got very low support for public assembly despite the coronavirus, whereas places like the US and the UK tend to have slightly higher levels of support. So I'm not sure that I do see the link there. But what I do disagree with slightly, Olly, in your contention there is that Suzanne Moore still has a platform. I think this is a slightly sort of lazy way of talking about cancel culture, and I think it's one of the ways in which cancel culture has kind of become a bit misrepresented, in much the same way that sort of a slogan like defund the police is misrepresented, in that it doesn't really mean what it literally means. I think cancel culture has got to be sort of specifically defined as a deliberate effort to sort of stigmatise individuals for their views or whip up support to gang up on that individual, or even target their employers and their means of making a living. I think in that regard, actually, to describe someone like Suzanne Moore as having been cancelled probably is true, because in all of those examples, in the example of Suzanne Moore and her leaving The Guardian, that I think there probably has been a concerted effort to make association with her taboo and to target her employer in The Guardian, which is obviously one of the things that she mentioned in her long resignation letter on Unheard, that she didn't feel she'd been protected from that kind of thing, or the paper hadn't stuck with her through those things. So I think in that regard, it's more of an attempt to publicly shame somebody, I think, than it is a sort of literal removal of someone's ability to speak or to have a platform at all.
There's also maybe, Kieran, a danger of conflating these things, in the sense that if you're a libertarian who believes strongly in freedom of speech, you then naturally start being a person who wants to resist coronavirus legislation. And, those are... You shouldn't feel naturally pushed into doing that if you're putting other people at risk, never mind yourself.
Okay, well, I think, to start with Suzanne Moore, this idea to me, when I first read this story, it became clear to me that this was about a safety issue, but it was about, working out it was a collection of writers from the Guardian Observer who were saying that we feel like some of the things that have been published actively harm the safety of some of our most vulnerable employees. And, of course, the example was given by a trans employee who felt that they were unsafe in the workplace. And so I think that when I saw these, Suzanne wasn't sacked, of course, she resigned. These 338 employees that she cited as bullying her seems like it's potentially, defamatory. This idea of saying that I've been bullied by my colleagues who have legitimately said we feel like this might harm the safety of some of our more vulnerable readers or even some of our most vulnerable employees, seems to me like this is an advocate for moving towards a place of more thoughtful, more supportive writing, journalism that has a greater duty of care, journalism that does its due diligence. I don't see this as a loss. I don't see this as a mourning of any kind of speech or liberty or safety. I see this as enhancing this framework that we have and actually inviting more voices to join these conversations. And I feel like that seems like a hopeful and a good thing to me.
And on coronavirus, which you see as something separate?
Yes, I take the point that there has been certainly a link this year between what might be called anti-vaxxing communities or people who are sceptical of some of the restrictions that they've been made, and people who refuse to wear masks and saying that this is this is an infraction on our civil liberties and rights. Therefore, we're going to reject them, and we're advocating for freedom of speech and all these sorts of things. But I think that that's probably a different political ideology, or that's about something different. And it's usually undertaken by people who aren't considering some of the vulnerabilities that we're talking about.
Okay, so Felicity, it seems like your theory is being trashed here. Give us some more red meat.
Yeah, I'd come back. I'm not convinced they are as distinct and separate as my fellow contributors are making out. One example would be, which I think crosses both arenas, is the Great Barrington Declaration, which, if the uniting theme of these two, the ideas being suppressed, is censorship and the ability of there being a free marketplace of ideas, the Great Barrington Declaration is a really good example of this, because it was respected scientists who had a policy of focus protectors when it came to COVID-19. It was an alternative imagining and ways of dealing with the COVID crisis. And it was effectively censored. They were derided. They were basically told that what they were espousing was, again, to use the word, unsafe. It was incredibly hard to find it, actually. If you did a Google for the Great Barrington Declaration at one point, it was really hard to find it. It wasn't carried by much of the media, and politicians were kind of briefing against it. It was the same with the anti-lockdown protests. You could protest on things like Black Lives Matter this year, but if you tried to protest against government measures, some people were fined huge amounts of money. The protests were broken up.
Because the argument would be that their actions would be harming other people. That is the argument against, isn't it? So in that sense, it's different to just a thought.
But this is part of how we so readily give up our freedoms, because we hadn't actually proven that. And in order for us to be a democracy where our freedoms are kind of valued and cherished, you needed to have the kind of... at one point, we didn't even have all our MPs debating in the House of Commons because we were so worried about social distancing. We had the Coronavirus Act of 2020, which was passed in a day, which is basically unheard of. To say that our freedoms weren't taken away and impinged upon is just not true, really.
What I find really interesting about all three stories on today's show, it seems to me, are about a kind of generational schism. We were talking about younger people who are looking into the work of Karl Marx. We were talking about Kenya potentially having an advantage at COVID because there are younger people there. And on this story, it's really a generational shift, isn't it, between those who are prepared to, or more willing to enter a debate questioning things like Suzanne Moore, who's in her 60s, and younger people who are keener on cancel culture. I wonder where that puts you, Felicity, as the editor of The Week Junior, because it's actually your audience who are more likely to be arguing against you.
Well, my audience, we would never tackle things like... trans right. We are talking 8 to 14-year-olds, so I'm not sure we're talking about.
Sure, but let's say in 5 years' time when they might be engaged in these issues?
I'm not sure it is so stark as the older generations against the younger generations. I don't like the idea of pitting one against the other, and Suzanne Maud talks about that, and I do think that's slightly dangerous. I think there are people in every demographic who will have different opinions on this, so I'm not sure it is young versus old. I mean, it's young people who will be disproportionately affected, I would say, by these lockdown measures, you know, in terms of education opportunities, in terms of their employment, in terms of dating and going out and being able to party and being able to live your life, in terms of, there was a great piece in The Guardian yesterday about women not being able to access IVF fertility treatments, about, you know, women being able to have families and do what they want. It is young people embarking on their lives who will be affected the worst by this. So I hope they are aware. I hope they are the most aware that it is them who the taking away of their freedoms will probably most affect.
Joe, it does seem like cancel culture, if that's what we're calling it, is here to stay. You know, it's not really just a trend of 2020, is it? It's been kind of smouldering under the surface for a couple of years. But perception of risk in this very mainstream way, everyone considering the risk and safety to their person by stepping out their front door, that probably is something from 2020. And I wonder whether that is here to stay, whether people will continue thinking about risks even after they've been vaccinated, or whether actually there'll be a euphoria that risk doesn't have to enter their heads.
Yeah, I think you're right that weighing up risk is very much a 2020 theme, partly because no one's really had to, you know, do it before, as has been pointed out by kind of the type of people who like to dunk on old people on Twitter. Unless you know, if you were 90, you were 10 when the Second World War broke out. So, you know, we haven't really had to face a threat on our doorstep in Britain for a very long time. I'm not sure whether it will necessarily outlive the pandemic. And actually, I agree with Felicity that the free speech question isn't a generational issue, but I think the risk thing probably will be, because there'll be a generation of people our age that remember it very intently for the rest of their lives, probably, and there'll be a generation below us that don't remember it and probably won't have any recollection of the great pandemic summer of 2020. And so, no, I'm not convinced that the risk will outlive the pandemic. What I think, the type of risk assessment that I think probably will last is the type of risk assessment that I do think people increasingly feel in terms of what they can and can't speak about, or what they are and aren't comfortable speaking about in certain circles. And I do find that slightly troubling. And I think that probably is the bit that will last longer than the fear of getting on the tube or going into a busy pub.
Good. Well, I'm sure that's left everyone pumped for the turn of the year. Maybe let's all have another drink and look forward to 2022. But that is it from this edition of The Year Unwrapped. My thanks to Joe Evans, Felicity Capon and Kieran Yates. You guys never need to miss an episode of the show for the next year, though, when you subscribe to this podcast. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcasting app of choice and hit subscribe. I've been Olly Mann, our music is by Tom Morby, and the producer was Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.